Hello and welcome to another episode of Chuchu is a Ranker, and on this episode we are going to be discussing the discography of the English rock band Genesis. Formed in 1967 in the county of Surrey, Genesis started as a psychedelic pastoral pop act before quickly changing tact and becoming one of the forefront pioneers of the burgeoning progressive rock genre. During this period, the band's classic lineup came together that featured Peter Gabriel on vocals, Steve Hackett on lead guitar, Mike Rutherford on rhythm guitar and bass, Tony Banks on keys and Phil Collins on drums. After both Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett left to pursue their solo careers, Genesis turned in a new wave synthpop direction, with Phil Collins taking over on vocal duties. This era saw the band achieve worldwide success, with their smash hit 1986 album Invisible Touch briefly making Genesis one of the most popular rock bands in the world. After the departure of Phil Collins, who along with Peter Gabriel had become a massive solo star during the mid-80s, the band struggled on with a new vocalist Ray Wilson for one last album in 1997 before going on hiatus for a decade. In 2007 the band reunited with Phil Collins for a live tour, and also again in 2021 for the Last Domino tour, which seems very likely to be the band's final hurrah and farewell. And as for my own fandom, yeah, I love Genesis, they're actually one of my favourite bands. Although, as will quickly become apparent, I do definitely have a preference as to which era of the band I like more. So, without further ado, let's be complete rankers and rank up a storm. These are the studio albums of Genesis, ranked from worst to best. So we're going to be kicking off this list with From Genesis to Revelation from 1969, which was the band's debut LP. And this album was recorded when the band were still teenagers, and whose naivety saw them very much under the thumb of pop impresario Jonathan King, who plied the band with all sorts of dodgy long-term contracts. Thankfully the band's parents stepped in and put King and his manipulative ideals in place. And out of this relative turmoil came a pretty lackluster psychedelic pop record. There's not much that really connects this to the modern idea of Genesis. Jonathan King disliked the band's excessive leanings and kept pushing them down a simple pop route, even going as far as to limit or completely cut Tony Banks' solo passages. And what we're left with is just not what you want from a Genesis release. It's mostly innocuously ignorable yet also blandly dull acoustic and string compositions that rarely show any fight and sound far too similar to each other. I mean, from time to time you might get an interesting spurt. The Serpent is actually pretty rad with its layered backing vocals and sense of escalating psychedelic drama. Am I Very Wrong has some nice touches of Peter Gabriel's flute on it. Silent Sun is a short but epic ballad with a good sense of swooning romanticism, while In the Wilderness has an easy catchiness and some pretty good lyrics to boot. Fighting enemies with weapons made to kill. Death is an easy substitute for pride. Victors join together, happy in their bed, leaving cold outside the children of the dead. But yeah, a couple of decent tunes can't save this mire of general boredom from its inevitable fate. Tracks such as In the Beginning, The Conqueror, In Hiding, One Day, In Limbo, A Place to Call My Own and Window are as dull as the proverbial dishwater. And this mediocre set of songs is placed within the climes of late 1960s pop, where you had bands like the Beatles, the Kinks, the Zombies, the Byrds and a million others all competing for that same piece of the pie. Genesis at this point in their career and in this genre just can't compete with that. As such, From Genesis to Revelation is only really worthwhile as a minor curio from a band that went on to make vastly superior works. 1.5 stars. From first to last, as next we have the much maligned Calling All Stations from 1997, which was the band's 15th and final LP. And by this time Phil Collins was long gone, concentrating wholesale on his own solo career. So the final two members of Genesis, Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks, roped in Scottish singer Ray Wilson to complete their lineup and provide vocals. And the problems start right there, as while a technically competent singer, Ray Wilson's voice has about as much texture and charisma as a flaccid condom, his smooth toneless voice conveying no emotion whatsoever. Likewise, his more tenured bandmates are also running on empty here, offering up a set of bland paint-by-numbers prog tunes, which are done no favours by the equally bland 90s production. At its worst, Calling All Stations really does see the band hitting their nadir. Not About Us is a hoary old rock ballad that features a horrible cringy vocal performance from poor old Ray. The insipidly bland, If That's What You Need, has some god-awful lyrics that are so on the nose. They have the emotional subtlety of a wheel of cheese. Small Talk is a dire jumbled synthpop tune that sounds stuck in all the worst choices of 1982. Alien Afternoon is plagued by more awful lyrics about wanting to be abducted by aliens, even as its bitty guitar riff and cheesy synths vie to repel any intelligent life. While tracks like Uncertain Weather, There Must Be Some Other Way and One Man's Fool sound like the weaker parts of We Can't Dance, only somehow much worse. With such a damning appraisal, one might wonder how on earth this LP isn't in last place. Well, there ain't much in it, but ultimately the best tracks on this do actually sound a bit like Genesis, unlike the debut, which sounds like a bunch of unknown randos in a totally different band and genre. Opening title track and lead single, Calling All Stations, has a cool brooding quality to it that fools you into thinking the record might actually be worthwhile. Shipwrecked is a sweeping Britpop style ballad that has a simple, elegant charm to it. Congo is cheesy as all hell with its horrid synthesized guitar, but it also has an undeniably catchy vocal, so it kinda balances out. While The Dividing Line has some nice rattling percussion, a bit of cool synthwork that reminds you that Tony Banks is actually still there sometimes, and a fun instrumental climax. It's a decent tune. But yeah, the highlights are few and far between on Calling All Stations. It's a subpar album that really shouldn't have been made, and only succeeds in leaving an unnecessary stain on the legacy of Genesis. 1.5 stars. Now that we've dispensed with the obvious outliers, we've now entered into the band's main body of work, my least favourite of which is easily And Then There Were Three from 1978, which was the band's 9th LP. And of course the title refers to the departure of the band's rather excellent guitarist Steve Hackett, who I guess couldn't hack it anymore. I'll get my coat. Anyway, his departure left Genesis now standing with only 3 members left, Phil Collins, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. And here, in a possible knee-jerk reaction to losing their guitarist, the band turn in a more distinctly rocking direction. Indeed, this is arguably the band's most relentlessly clattering album, which is kind of admirable in a way, except they just haven't nailed it here. Far from it in fact, as this set of songs sounds a bit tired and repetitious. Genesis just sound a bit lost and in need of some kind of reset here. That said, even Genesis bumbling through the motions can still squeeze out the odd banger. Down and Out is absolutely rad, its growling energy and badass keypad break kickstarting the LP with a bang. Burning Rope is a decent prog tune that's defined by a pretty impressive guitar solo that feels like a bit of a middle finger to the recently departed Hackett. Deep in the Motherlode has a nice pulsing bass thrust that propels the track forward, plus its cowboy/pilgrimage lyrics are kinda fun. While Closer, Follow You, Follow Me is a simple yet melodically salient guitar pop tune that delights with its emotive wispiness and delicate heart. The track also became the band's first big hit. But elsewhere, the record does develop some notable problems. Firstly is the production, which really sucks. It has an unappealing processed thickness to it that makes everything sound overcooked. The tone also doesn't change much over the course of the album, which makes all the songs sound overly samey. The record also falls into a weird trap of repeating things from their previous LP, Wind and Wuthering. Undertow feels like a microwave version of that album's Afterglow, albeit with all the flavour cooked out. Ballad of Big shares way too many melodic similarities with All in a Mouse's Night, while Snowbound is basically just a reworked Blood on the Rooftops, only not as good. Although, to be fair, Snowbound isn't too bad, the lift-off in the chorus is quite pretty. But there are some outright fillery duds lurking around the tracklist too. Tunes such as Many Too Many with its bland stadium balladry, Scenes from a Night's Dream with its awful lyrics and fractured composition, and the blustery The Lady Lies just don't cut the proverbial mustard. So yeah, ultimately, And Then There Were Three is a poor album. It has a few great moments but is largely quite boring and is undoubtedly the Genesis record that I come back to the least. Well, save for the 2 below it on this list anyway, which I almost don't even count as Genesis records. Thankfully though, this is the only one of the band's main works that I don't really get on with. 2 stars. Next up we have We Can't Dance from 1991, which was the band's 14th LP and last to feature Phil Collins. And let's face facts, it should have probably been the band's last LP, full stop. And this album tends to be much maligned and dismissed by both fans and critics. But I personally feel that this record is not nearly as bad as its rather awful reputation suggests. Is it perfect? No, absolutely not. It has many problems. Foremost among those is the album's overlength. Clocking in at 1 hour and 11 minutes, We Can't Dance really does test your patience, overstaying its welcome by a fair old stretch. Plus, when it's at its weakest, you'll find some of the band's most boring material. Never a Time and Hold On My Heart are very dull ballads that sound like Phil Collins' solo tracks masquerading as Genesis tunes. While the likes of Tell Me Why and Way of the World are hookless slabs of unmemorable filler that auto-delete themselves from your brain the second they finish. Those tracks really should have been cut to save some precious time. But for the most part, everything else on this is pretty good. The record also has a unique atmosphere and vibe, with its laid-back sepia-tinged synth textures setting it apart from any other Genesis LP. It feels a bit more elegant and mature than most of the band's other work. Of course, that could also be construed as middle-aged slipper-wearing granddad music, but you know, tomato tomato. As for high spots, of course, all the hits are present and accounted for. No Son of Mine kicks the record off with one of the band's best singles. Its moody atmosphere, weird soaring guitar stabs and catchily explosive chorus, making it stand out as something special. Jesus He Knows Me has a revving pace and a fun satire-laden lyric about TV evangelism to enjoy. While I Can't Dance is an incredibly simple, swaggering rock tune that amuses with its earworm catchiness and highly memorable guitar riff. But away from the slick pop-inflected nuggets, there's also some great languorous prog epics to dig into that impress with their relaxing vibes. Driving the Last Spike is a nicely atmospheric, quietly creeping tune about the toils of working on the railway and its human cost. Dreaming While You Sleep requires a bit of patience, but ultimately comes together well with a slow burn catchiness and experimentation with minimalism. While Fading Light sees Tony Banks go off deep diving into all manner of engaging synth riffage. It would have made for a great final stanza from Genesis, but alas, that damn flaccid condom Ray Wilson. Damn him all to hell. Oh man, that's so mean, I'm sorry Ray. But yeah, add in the cool squiggly guitar riff and fun synth break of Living Forever, and the simple, direct and romantically unironic balladry of Since I Lost You, and you have an LP that totally defies its standing as the musical filth of all humanity. I mean, what can I tell you? I like this more than most people despite its myriad faults. 3 stars. Next up we have Invisible Touch from 1986, which was the band's 13th LP and also their biggest selling one, with the album hitting number 1 on the UK Albums Chart and number 3 on the American Billboard, and going on to sell millions of copies worldwide, and in the process, redefining how people perceive Genesis as a band. And what we have here is Genesis at their pop peak, leaning far more into the stylings of Phil Collins' solo career than at any other point. There really isn't that much difference between the soundscapes and indeed quality of Invisible Touch and Phil's No Jacket Required. And yeah, it's a pretty good 1980s pop record with an occasional diversion into synth prog. The opening title track, Invisible Touch, is the band's slickest moment of radio pop. Its bouncing, Afrobeat inflected melody and sing-along catchiness handcrafted to light up the FM radio waves. It also was a number 1 single in the US. Tonight 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 blends some ominous sounding synth with a fantastic soaring chorus. Plus I love Tony Banks' subtle synth break on the track, it's awesome. Land of Confusion is a twisting, catchy yet dark-hued pop hit that saw Collins taking lyrical swipes at those in power, defiantly stating, "My generation will put it right. We're not just making promises that we know we'll never keep." Okay Phil, that's, yeah, totally convincing mate. In Too Deep is the most moving pop song of the 1980s. It's an epic meditation on the importance and beauty of monogamy. Now bend over so I can see your asshole. Ah god, I love American Psycho. Sorry Patrick Bateman, In Too Deep is cheesy pap that's very dull. Save for sounding like a metaphor for apologising because you're about to nut just before she comes. You know I love you, but I just can't take it. I'm in too deep. Seems that we've briefly turned the corner into the negatives. I'll also note that the other ballad, Throwing It All Away, has more cheese than a stuffed crust pizza. Those overwrought tracks are just not really my jam. Although, ironically, I do like a few of the more over-the-top cuts on Duke, but hey, that's for later. Domino, however, is for right now, and it swings things back over to the good side of the fence. It's 10-minute synth prog opus, entertaining throughout its duration, and even exciting the blood when it picks up and starts to properly slap. While the Brazilian is a not quite great but decent synth-led instrumental that ends the record on an appealingly proggy note. So yeah, when it comes to Invisible Touch, I can't help but use words like pretty good and decent, because that's exactly what it is. It's slick and catchy and super successful, and I do enjoy it, but it's still not quite what I'd call a truly great record. I mean, with maybe the exception of Tonight 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 and Domino, I don't think I'd lose even a wink of sleep if someone told me that I could never hear any of these songs again. But still, as I said, it's a decent, enjoyable pop record, no more, no less, 3.5 stars. Next up we have Abacab from 1982, which was the band's 11th LP. And this album represents the moment where Genesis completely abandoned their guitar-based prog rock and turned wholesale into new wave. And with this change came a brand new instrumental sound that was powered by these giant blocky primary sounding synths. It was a really electronic, stark and kind of cold sound that immediately sounded a million miles away from the band's more classical leaning prog rock of the 1970s. But that's not to say that Abacab is synthpop. Far from it actually, as the album is quite obtuse, experimental and far less commercial than its reputation often implies. Sure, I mean there are a couple of poppier tunes such as the catchy horn splash No Reply and Who Done It, which amuses with its super city blast of cockney tinged madness. That track is actually loathed by certain sections of the Genesis fanbase, but I personally find it to be quite entertaining. But most of the record is given over to tracks that push the band into unusual structures and brand new sonic textures, and the majority of it works really well. The opening title track, Abacab, is wicked with its memorably rhythmic bass, stark synths and cool interplaying guitar lines. The extended instrumental section is particularly awesome. Me and Sarah Jane has a jumbled proggy composition, with Tony Banks' dramatic rising and falling synth lines bringing a fun unpredictability with them. The track nicely straddles the line between the old and the new. Keep It Dark has a great muggy atmosphere and a really good urgent vocal performance from Phil Collins. While Dodo/Lurker is an interesting yet ominous tune with a frisson of gothic horror lingering around it. It's pretty cool and recalls the band's theatricality of old. But despite its multitude of good songs, the record isn't entirely satisfying for me personally. Firstly, that big primary synth sound that I mentioned is definitely my least favourite Genesis soundscape. Whilst it is impressively bold, I also feel that it lacks any sense of subtlety. And secondly, the album ends a bit disappointingly, with the two closing tracks taking a downturn in general quality. Like It or Not is an utterly forgettable dollop of filler, while the closer, Another Record, feels anticlimactic, especially considering how experimental and strange the majority of the LP had been. But yeah, I still think Abacab represents a win for Genesis. Its best tracks are excellent, and the artistic impetus of experimentation and reinvention is very much appreciated despite the odd bump in the road. 3.5 stars. Next up we have the band's self-titled LP from 1983, which is often referred to as Shapes, and was the band's 12th LP. And whilst I pointed out that the band's previous album, Abacab, was not really synthpop, this self-titled LP definitely is synthpop. The majority of this record focuses on short, sharp, flighty pop tunes that deliver immediate hooks and giant catchy choruses. And despite being light years away from their classic material, it's all pretty darn consistent and pretty darn good stuff. In fact, for me personally, this represents the band's most convincing straight-up pop album. Of course, there are occasional moments where the band do deviate from that typical pop formula. The opening hit, Mama, is arguably the darkest Genesis song. Its sinister, mechanized soundscape and unnerving laughs from Phil Collins marking it out as something interestingly unique within the band's discography. Home by the Sea and its extended instrumental coda, Second Home by the Sea, are absolutely awesome. The bright crystalline melodies, briny windswept synths and catchy vocals trawling up some great coastal sonic vistas. The entire 2-track suite is a wonderful little callback to the prog days of yore. But the rest of the record is synthpop central. That's all as a slice of lightweight catchy pop fluff that has a simple throwaway charm to it. Illegal Alien is perhaps a little, let's say culturally insensitive, with Phil Collins affecting a faux Jamaican accent. But who gives a rat's ass when it's just so damn catchy? You're making me crazy, Phil! Just a Job to Do is a scrambling pop tune with a fun bouncing energy. Silver Rainbow is a late album highlight with its booming drums, scratchy composition and cool dovetailing chorus. While It's Gonna Get Better ends the record with some dreamy textures and a hopeful lyric that's not nearly as cheesy as the title implies. In fact, the only real sore spot is Taking It All Too Hard, which is another one of those soppy ballads. But at least I do incrementally prefer it to those on Invisible Touch. So yeah, my cards are now obviously on the table. I'm much more a fan of the 1970s prog era of Genesis than I am the 1980s pop one. That said, I do enjoy this self-titled LP quite a bit indeed, despite it arguably being the most pop orientated of all the band's works. 4 stars. Next up we have Trespass from 1970, which was the band's second LP, although to be fair I think that most people, including the members of the band themselves, think of Trespass as being the first proper Genesis album. But the classic lineup still hadn't quite come together at this point. The band's original guitarist Anthony Phillips was still manning the fretboards, and John Mayhew was stationed behind the drum kit. And this album, counter to most other Genesis records, was written on the road rather than from scratch in the studio. The band simply came in off the road and laid down exactly what they had been playing out in the working man's clubs and dingy basements of rainy old England. And England is very much what this album is. Here we have a traditional, folk-inflected album, with lots of beautifully pastoral mellotron and organ, twinkling 12-string guitar riffs and a gently swaying bucolic atmosphere. The record strongly evokes sonic images of England's forests and the tweed gentlemanly aesthetics of the southern home counties. And in terms of quality, the record is pretty consistent and entertaining, with even the slightly weaker material such as Dusk, White Mountain and Visions of Angels adding a strong sense of atmospheric texturing to the record. Basically, everything on Trespass really helps further the album's overall vibe. But the true highlights are obviously the more elongated tracks that set up the basic prog template of where Genesis were about to go. Opener, Looking for Someone, immediately shows off the band's progression from their rather stilted debut. The track's shifting structure, subtle keys and dramatic guitar lines ably setting up a new, more dynamic direction for the group. The 9-minute prog epic Stagnation is brilliant with its gently rolling pastoral soundscape. The sense of sonic space and Tony Banks' super English sounding keyboard solo are simply irresistible. The Knife meanwhile is a great rocking closer, its serrated guitar riffage and war-torn lyrics standing out as the most thrillingly muscular tune that the band had released up to that point. It feels like a kind of dry run for the musical box on their next LP. So yeah, Trespass is a very charming album of pastoral prog that represented a huge step forward for the band. Its only real downside is that Genesis would expand and improve upon every single aspect of the record on later releases. But if you respect its placing within the band's discography, it's a wonderfully formative piece of the Genesis puzzle. 4 stars. Next up we have Nursery Crime from 1971, which was the band's third LP. And finally, this was the point where the classic lineup properly came together. The band's original guitarist Anthony Phillips had decided to leave the band due to suffering from debilitating stage fright, while drummer John Mayhew was not really considered to be a good fit for the band and thus was politely asked to leave. This of course opened the door for the new boys Steve Hackett and Phil Collins to take their places respectively. And what we have here is basically the expansion of the band's previous album Trespass. That southern counties, bucolic, almost medieval sounding traditional English soundscape is still in full effect. Only this time around the band are doubling down on the more rocking aspects that were displayed on the last album's closer, The Knife. Indeed, Nursery Crime is actually one of the band's most raw and rough and tumble albums. There's a really fun sense of youthful energy that radiates out of this record. This is a mosh pit ready, crowd pleaser of a set that alternates lovely pastoral moments with blasts of searing rock. And it's pretty awesome with almost every track hitting its mark. Minor nitpicky quibbles are actually quite thin on the ground, but I would say that the pastoral mood piece Harlequin is a bit slight and disposable, while Peter Gabriel's first foray into Cockney theatrics via Harold the Barrel, whilst fine, is definitely the weakest of his efforts in that arena. But everything else on this hits that proggy sweet spot. The opener, the musical box, is incredible, its beautiful serene acoustics giving way to an awesome rockist explosion. It's one of the most thrilling tunes the band have ever recorded and has some real fire and brimstone energy behind the guitar work. Mwah! Chef's kiss, that track is just straight fire badassery. The Return of the Giant Hogweed is another badass rocking prog epic with some fun Day of the Triffids inspired lyrics and Steve Hackett showing off some early implementation of the guitar technique of tapping. Or should that be tapping ass? No, just tapping. Seven Stones has a delightful pastoral element to it. Tony Banks' lovely mellotron riffs mixing nicely with the track's sense of sweeping epicness, while the Fountain of the Salmacis has a cool mythical tinged ebb and flow to its closing prog opus. So yeah, add into that the lovely acoustics and grief-stricken lyrics of Absent Friends, and you have an excellent prog LP that is not only an exciting listen but also paved the way forward for the next few records. 4.5 stars. Next up we have Wind and Wuthering from 1976, which was the band's 8th LP and second from that particular year, quickly following in the footsteps of A Trick of the Tail. It was also the last album to feature guitarist Steve Hackett, who departed the band soon after recording to concentrate on his own solo career, after becoming somewhat frustrated with the repeated rejection of his musical ideas by the other members of Genesis. This in a way was a little ironic, as Wind and Wuthering is probably the album where Steve Hackett is featured the most prominently, with tracks such as 11th Earl of Mar and Blood on the Rooftops ably displaying his beautiful guitar licks. But in general, Wind and Wuthering represents Genesis at the most ethereal and atmospherically salient. The beautiful cover art kinda says it all really. The album has a dreamy, relaxed, romantic quality to it, as well as a subtle cathartic sadness. In terms of its musical soundscapes, Wind and Wuthering is arguably the band's most outright emotive release. This aspect is especially notable on the record's excellent bevy of beautiful instrumentals, such as What Gorilla, Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers and In That Quiet Earth. And the sequence of the last four songs, which takes in the latter two of the instrumentals I just noted, is a catharsis-filled tour de force. As bookending them, you have the gorgeous classical guitar trills and grandstanding chorus of Blood on the Rooftops, and the simple yet elegantly grandiose mega ballad Afterglow. It all adds up to one hell of an emotional gut-punching climax. Other fantastic tunes include the opening guitar-forward prog of 11th Earl of Mar, the classic piano-touched beauty of One for the Vine, which sees Tony Banks wallowing in his own brilliance, and the languorous pop balladry of Your Own Special Way, which I like mostly due to its gorgeous electric piano break. In fact, the only real sore spot is the track All in a Mouse's Night. Musically, the song is actually pretty great, but the lyrics are just so dumb. It's literally about a mouse scurrying around avoiding traps and shit. I mean, come on guys, is that seriously the best you can do? Never mind the meaning of life, or the existential dread of loneliness, or the slow decay of traditional culture. Here's a mouse and some cheese. But yeah, one serving of questionable lyrics aside, and Wind and Wuthering is a truly superb album of emotionally inviting, classically leaning prog rock that is as atmospheric as the day is long. 4.5 stars. So, we're going to be kicking off the top 5 with Duke from 1980, which was the band's 10th LP. And here we find Genesis nimbly bouncing back from the lackluster And Then There Were Three, with a fantastic transitional album that caught the band holding both their prog side and their pop side in perfect balance. Of course, that's a realization that you can only come to in hindsight, as at the time Genesis attempting chart-ready pop music was almost unheard of, with only occasional moments such as Your Own Special Way and Follow Me, Follow You even daring to suggest that the band might go down that road someday. But Duke doesn't so much go down that road as absolutely scream down it. Tracks such as the bouncing surf rock inflected Misunderstanding, the Led Zeppelin style catchy stadium rock of Turn It On Again, and the epic Lighters Aloft balladry of Alone Tonight represented full bore shifts into pop, of the likes that Genesis fans had never seen before. For the hardened prog faithful among their fanbase, it must have been a disquieting time. But I personally love all those songs. Yes, even Alone Tonight. As I've said before, the schmaltzy Collins fronted ballads are not really my jam, except that one. That gigantic lift off in the chorus just gets me every time and makes me want to sing along at the top of my voice. I mean, it's great. Of course, the record also has plenty of prog on it to enjoy too. In fact, the initial plan was to have an entire side of the album as one long suite, a la Supper's Ready, which would have had the tracks Behind the Lines, Duchess, Guide Vocal, Turn It On Again, Duke's Travels and Duke's End, all seamlessly merging into one. But the band ended up splitting up the suite across the record, mostly because they didn't want to draw comparisons with Supper's Ready. But I personally think that it works well in its split form, nicely spreading out the highlights. And speaking of proggy highlights, the likes of Heath Haze and Cul-de-sac have a nice self-contained atmosphere. Duchess is great with its sparkly catchiness and interesting lyrics about a female singer falling on hard times. While the climax of the album, the duo of Duke's Travels and Duke's End, is spectacular, especially Duke's Travels, which has a raft of awesome keyboard riffs that sound like some kind of gnarly pirate sea shanty. I absolutely love it. And that moment at the finale where Collins comes in with a reprise of Guide Vocal, chef's kiss, all the hair on my body stands straight up every single time. Yes, even my pubes. So yeah, Duke is the perfect Genesis pop album in my opinion. It's super catchy with some great hits on it, but also has more than enough of the band's old school sensibilities to keep the prog lovers engaged too, and for that reason it's actually one of my most played Genesis records. 4.5 stars. Next up we have A Trick of the Tail from 1976, which was the band's 7th LP and first to come in the wake of Peter Gabriel's departure. Peter Gabriel had decided to leave the band after their Lamb Lies Down on Broadway's tour due to a combination of growing tensions and good old artistic differences. As such, many publications predicted the end of Genesis, as how could they possibly continue without their headline-grabbing charismatic frontman? Thankfully, the band proved all the doomsayers wrong, with Phil Collins stepping out from behind the drum kit and taking over on vocals with instant success. Basically speaking, Genesis didn't even miss a beat. Of course, this transition and acceptance was helped no end by the fact that A Trick of the Tail was an excellent album of pastoral prog that set aside the mind-boggling narrative scope of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and followed on from where Selling England by the Pound left off. And from top to bottom, the album is stuffed full of fantastic material. Dance on a Volcano kicks off the record in a suitably explosive way. It's dynamic rocking prog making you briefly exclaim, "Peter who?" Entangled takes the classical acoustic guitar stylings of Genesis to their logical conclusion, with a beautifully elegant folky tune that lets Steve Hackett's delicacy shine. Squonk is a swaggering proggy rocker that's powered by a throaty pulsing bass line. Mad Mad Moon sees Tony Banks running wild with his classical piano lines, putting together a stunningly beautiful composition that sounds like he should be wearing a tuxedo while listening to it. While Robbery, Assault and Battery has Phil Collins taking over from Gabriel in the arena of Cockney crime epics, and doing a very good job of it too. The track is a lot of daft fun, plus Tony Banks' synth break is absolutely awesome. My favourite off of this though is Ripples, which is a gorgeous meditation on aging and mortality that features a huge catchy chorus and a catharsis-filled instrumental break that sees Hackett delivering some truly unforgettable backwards guitar atmospherics. It's just one of the band's most transcendent moments. So yeah, add into that the lightweight charm of the doo-wop inflected title track and the reprise-filled closing instrumental Los Endos, and you have a spectacular LP that buoyed Genesis up at a time when they were in danger of drowning. 4.5 stars. Next up we have The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974, which was the band's 6th LP and last to feature Peter Gabriel. And what we have here is unarguably the band's most ambitious record, a sprawling double album that clocks in at 1 hour and 34 minutes and has a singular narrative running through all of its 23 tracks. It's an exhausting monolith of an LP that requires quite a lot of patience, but ultimately rewards with its scope, complexity and excellent cohesive atmosphere. It also doesn't sound like any other Genesis record. Texturally speaking, it sounds a lot more like art rock than prog, with its cold, stark, futuristically urbane sound going on to inspire the burgeoning art rock scene, and was a notable influence on Radiohead when they came to make their seminal art rock masterpiece OK Computer. That said, despite all of its undeniably massive brilliance, there are still a few niggles to contend with on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Firstly, the length. 94 minutes is too long for any album. Because of the flowing narrative, you can't really pick and choose tracks from the record, and there's no point to only listen to one half of it. After all, what's the point in a story that's only half finished? The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway really is a kind of all or nothing type of experience. You just have to strap in and take all 94 minutes in one go. Which, to be honest, is a pretty tall order, and leaves the record in a precarious place as something that's only really dusted off when you have a lot of time and are in that very specific mood. Also, Peter Gabriel's overall narrative is a bit all over the place. It's actually pretty obtuse and hard to follow, and when all is said and done, the tale of Rael and his trippy adventure through a dark underworld is not really all that satisfying or emotionally deep. It's impressive, sure, but it's still a bit hollow in my opinion. Plus, there are a couple of tracks on the second half of the album that don't entirely float my boat. The Colony of Slippermen is a track that I've never really liked. Its off-kilter melodies falling through the cracks for me personally. While the two closing tracks really feel anticlimactic. In the Rapids may well be narratively important, but musically there's just not much going on there. While It is the most anodyne, straightforward rock song on the entire record, it's such a bland way to finish an album that has this much scope and ambition. Why does that have to be the closer? Like, seriously, why? So those are my nitpicks and the not inconsiderable reasons as to why The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is not my favourite Genesis LP. That said, you can still take those nitpicks and march them the fuck out of here because the album is still absolutely crackerjack and its blemishes are like stones thrown into a raging river of awesomeness. Whilst the narrative is perhaps a little suspect, the musical atmosphere of the piece is infallible, drawing you in and papering over the story's holes like a hard grafting handyman with an arse crack the size of the Grand Canyon, with the compositions coalescing perfectly to form a deeply atmospheric freefall down a beautifully dark and slightly unnerving rabbit hole. And as for highlights, well, I wouldn't even know where to begin, as the list is so long that we'd be here all day. But my cherry picks from an insanely rammed track list would include the opening title track that kicks the record off with a catchy bang and a stark soundscape that is immediately fresh and inviting. The Cage uses a pulsing bass line to propel Gabriel's tales of being in the madhouse. Tony Banks' fluttering keyboard break is also rad. Back in NYC is a moody rocker with a distinctive rolling keyboard riff running through it, as well as a cool growling vocal performance from Peter Gabriel. Counting Out Time is a horny pubescent slice of catchy pop that shines due to its uncharacteristically bright melody. While The Carpet Crawlers is spectacularly beautiful, its gorgeous balladry sending warm musical waves of catharsis washing over you, despite its kind of slightly harrowing drug-inflected lyrics. But I really am just scratching the surface there, from the darkly creepy instrumental The Waiting Room, to the slithering monster-infested balladry of The Lamia, to the catchy upbeat guitar riffage of Here Comes the Supernatural Anaesthetist, to the joyous mostly instrumental Riding the Scree. There's just tons and tons of really great stuff to enjoy here. So yeah, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is singular in its vision, scope and ambition. There's nothing else quite like this particular LP, it really is one of a kind. So despite the odd minor bump in the road here and there, for its torrent of perpetual brilliance, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway gets a rock solid all-time classic, 5 stars. Next up we have Foxtrot from 1972, which was the band's 4th LP, and this album represents the peak of the formative Genesis years. The band's previous 2 albums, Trespass and Nursery Crime, felt like explorative steps into the world of pastoral prog, but Foxtrot is the moment where the styles come together with pinpoint precision, with all the blemishes and minor quibbles ironed out. Foxtrot is simply perfect, with each one of its 6 tracks shining like a nugget of top tier prog rock gold. Watcher of the Skies is a great SF-tinged opener, which stands out especially due to its bombastic opening riff that sounds like it owes a lot to the Mars Suite by G.A. Holst. Timetable is a lovely melodic piece with some decent lyrics about the passing of time and a simple yet effective piano break. Get 'Em Out by Friday represents the best of Gabriel's Cockney-inflected lyrical epics, with its daft but highly entertaining lyrics about breeding smaller people to save city space being a lot of fun. The track also has several awesome pastoral breaks to savour too, it's just a great track all round. Can Utility and the Coastliners has a beautiful guitar-forward composition that sounds like a warm-up for the pastoral mastery of their next album, Selling England by the Pound. While Horizons is a wonderful classical guitar piece from Steve Hackett that works brilliantly as a gorgeous palate cleanser before Supper's Ready. And speaking of Supper's Ready, the track is 23 minutes of arguably the greatest prog epic ever put to tape. It's an unbelievably brilliant, impossible tapestry of different ideas and textures that incorporates a few distinct movements, yet still perfectly coalesces into a concrete overall piece. Every single second of the track is perfect, but special props go out to the super bombastic Apocalypse in 9/8 section, and the emotionally soaring New Jerusalem climax that appropriately feels like the end of a massive journey. Mwah! Chef's kiss, that track is just an absolute masterpiece. So yeah, Foxtrot succeeds through sheer consistency. In fact, the record is probably the most consistent of all the Genesis works. Every single second of the album is a consummate joy to behold. 5 stars. So here we are at the top of the mountain, and the Genesis Gold Medal is going to go to Selling England by the Pound, which was the band's 5th LP from 1973. And here we have the greatest pastoral prog album ever recorded, it's just that simple. And the band really do double down on those pastoral elements here. Cue copious use of the mellotron, 12-string guitars and lots of baroque and medieval sounding riffs. The entire album sounds like being in a manicured maze on a sprawling country estate, it's just so delightfully English. But countering the bucolic traditional English sensibilities are Peter Gabriel's lyrics, that regularly ponder on the corruption and death of traditional English culture and values. No more is this more apparent than on the opener, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, and the closer, Isle of Plenty. The album's famous opening line, "Can you tell me where my country lies?" speaks immediately to the sense of a loss of identity, while Gabriel goes on to cajole, "Chewing through your wimpy dreams, they eat without a sound, digesting England by the pound," which alluded to England's first hamburger chain, the Americanization of Britain and the general public's sheep-like acceptance of the death of Englishness. The pun-filled closer, Isle of Plenty, takes some thinly veiled potshots at the explosion of supermarkets and the chain store consumerism that put paid to local privately owned shops. In fact, the entire album aches with a feeling of nostalgia and loss for the idea of proud, upstanding Victoria-era England, and it stands as one of the very best examples of that kind of record, alongside the likes of the Village Green Preservation Society by the Kinks, The Queen is Dead by the Smiths, and Skylarking by XTC. It's awesome and really hits a lyrical sweet spot for me personally. Musically, the band's members all hit their peak on this LP too. Tony Banks lays claim to being the greatest rock keyboardist ever here. His swooningly beautiful piano intro and synth explosion on Firth of Fifth are just to die for, while his 4-minute keyboard solo on Cinema Show is simply mind-blowing. It's actually my favourite solo ever played on any instrument ever. Mwah! Chef's kiss! Tony Banks, I salute you, you are a god behind the keys. Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford as the rhythm section also go to town here too. Rutherford's hectic rhythm guitar on Dancing with the Moonlit Night is so badass and strident, while both he and Collins absolutely rampage on the climax of Cinema Show, lending the track so much more energy. Collins also gets a chance to step out in front of the mic for the delicate, classical guitar-backed More Fool Me. Of course, Steve Hackett is also on fire here too. His tapping technique is nicely on display during the thunderously chest-beating instrumental section on Dancing with the Moonlit Night, while he gets arguably his best moment ever on Firth of Fifth, with his atmospheric string-bending guitar solo transcending into the realms of beautiful catharsis. His instrumental tune, After the Ordeal, also has a wonderful grandiose sweep to it. Now we've already touched upon Peter Gabriel's lyrical brilliance here, but he also gets to be playful too. His lightweight catchy chorus on I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe sending Genesis to number 21 on the UK singles chart, which was the band's first minor hit. While the Battle of Epping Forest is tons of fun, as Gabriel details a bunch of colourful London gangsters battling to the death in a violent melee, over a lovely medieval sounding pastoral backing. So yeah, Selling England by the Pound is a mind-blowingly brilliant album. I never ever get tired of the record, no matter how many times I spin it. For me personally, it's an ironclad top 5 record of all time, and could even arguably lay claim to being my favourite album ever made on its best days when I catch it in just the right mood. 5 stars. So now we've come to the end of my deep dive, the question remains, did I gain more appreciation for the artist? And the answer this time is, perhaps, incrementally? Genesis are one of my favourite artists, so I know all of these records inside out, but it was still nice to be reminded of just how consistent and fantastic the majority of their discography is. And that's my list, but of course I know that won't be your list, so why not sound off in the comments and tell me how you'd rank these records? Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and all that other kind of YouTube jazz. Make sure to take care of yourself, but most importantly, just keep on ranking.